if a candidate is receiving money from a particular PAC and they end up being elected, that will tend to affect how they will vote on certain bills that come up, right, in Congress. And so I think that's really the mechanism, right? It's almost like a quid pro quo, a PAC is throwing money at a particular candidate and they get elected and they say, well, and recall also that the congressional district term is only 2 years. So every 2 years, these guys are up for re-election.
जब पैसा इन्वॉल्व हो जाए, व्हाट रोल डू आइडियाज प्ले? अगर के फॉर एग्जांपल जो हमारी डेमोक्रेसी की डेफिनेशन दैट वी थिंक ऑफ है वो ये है कि जी मैं आ रहा हूँ कह के जी हमने लोगों की खुशहाली करनी है, आप आ रहे हैं कि हमने एक्सपोर्ट बढ़ानी है, कोई मतलब कोई ऐसा चीज है, या आप आ रहे हैं कि मैंने प्रोविंसेस बनाने हैं और मैं कहता हूँ नहीं जी हमने लोकल कम। हम सोचते हैं जो वोटिंग है वो एक आइडियाज की जंग है। हम एक प्लेटफॉर्म पेश करते हैं और इन द आइडियल सर्कमस्टांसिस लोग वोट करते हैं एक प्लेटफॉर्म के लिए, उससे वो जनरल वेल जो है निकलती है और माशाल्लाह डेमोक्रेसी बड़ी अच्छी चलती है। तो अगर पैसे से डेमोक्रेसी चल रही है तो ये तो थोड़ा सा परेशानी की बात नहीं है?
जब से 26th or 27th Amendment आई, I've been saying to them, I kind of feel like doing game theory or trying to look at these sorts of situations, this phenomena from a game theoretic perspective is futile because, the standard, the underlying assumption of any sort of game theoretic model is that the rules are set and everybody plays by the rules of the game that's set, right? That's what defines the game, is that what the rules of the game are. And we've seen, I think, that that's just completely gone out the window in Pakistan, right?
तो
Yeah.
आप कैसे डिफाइन करते हैं? एक तो तनख्वाह है पर दूसरी चीजें भी हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल बिहेवियरल इकोनॉमिक्स बताती है कि कुछ लोग हैं जो बड़े मोटिवेटेड होते हैं और चाहते हैं कुछ काम करना, या उनको शौक होता है काम का, या उनको शौक होता है अपनी शोहरत बनाने का वगैरह। तो यू कैन प्ले
Sure.
ऑन मैनी मैनी एवेन्यू, सिर्फ पैसा नहीं और एवेन्यूज भी हैं।
Yes.
जैसे कि
Yes.
मैं हमेशा कहता हूँ कि बरतानिया ने कमाल किया था अपने जमाने में कि वो आपके नाम के आगे 3 लफ्ज लगा देते थे और आप उसके लिए मर जाते थे, वो सर लगा देते थे ऐसा है, आप मर जाते। हमने तमगों को एक मजाक बना दिया तो किसी को अब तमगे के लिए काम करने का कोई फायदा नहीं है, ठीक है।
uh,
तो अब मसला ये है कि अगर हम सोचें इससे भी बैक इनटू द जो दूसरी स्ट्रैंड ऑफ लिटरेचर कह रही है कि इंस्टीट्यूशंस आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, व्हिच इज
yes. Yes.
थिंग्स लाइक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन वगैरह वगैरह। तो इस पे रोशनी डालें ना कि प्रिंसिपल एजेंट फ्रेमवर्क इज वेरी गुड, आई अप्रिशिएट दैट, बड़ी अच्छी बात कर रहे हैं कि वेरी गुड वे टू थिंक, बट इट्स स्टिल विद इन टू पार्टीज। अस्सलाम वालेकुम जी, वेलकम टू सिया कॉन्वर्सेशंस, दिस इज नदीम उल हक। जैसे आप सबको पता है मैं कोशिश करता हूँ कि सारे अच्छे इकोनॉमिस्ट मुफक्किरों को पकड़ें ताकि हम कोशिश करें कि पाकिस्तान में एक सोशो इकोनॉमिक कह लें, इकोनॉमिक ना कहें, पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमिक कह लें, एक नैरेटिव हम इस्टेब्लिश करें जो पढ़े लिखे लोगों का है, जो हमारे रिसर्चर्स का है। सिर्फ ये नहीं कि हम मीडिया की बातें सुने। इस वक्त तो मसला ये है कि हर मीडिया एंकर इकोनॉमिस्ट बना बैठा है, हर मीडिया एंकर डिप्लोमेसी का एक्सपर्ट बना बैठा है, हर मीडिया एंकर सोशियोलॉजी का एक्सपर्ट बना बैठा है, और हमारे जो यूनिवर्सिटीज के लोग हैं वो बेचारे साइलेंट हैं। तो ये उनको निकालने की कोशिश है और उनसे बात करने की कोशिश। तो आज मुझे बहुत खुशी होती है कि आई हैव गॉट Osama Khan, a professor at LUMS, mashallah, one of a young breed of economists who are doing very well, internationally recognized लोग हैं। तो ओसामा खान साहब से पूछते हैं, ओसामा साहब पहले तो हमें बताइए आपने पढ़ाई कहाँ की, एंड व्हाट हैज योर रिसर्च बीन?
Right. Assalamu alaikum, Nadeem Saab. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, for having me here. It's a pleasure. So a bit of an academic background. I studied economics and philosophy in my undergraduate at the University of St. Andrews. And then my first love was actually philosophy. So I did a master's in analytical philosophy from Carnegie Mellon University. And then when I was applying for PhD programs, उस वक्त भी, my first preference was to continue with philosophy. And then my mother said, yeah, economics kar lo, otherwise you'll starve to death. Maybe she had a point. And so as it happened, I ended up doing economics at Johns Hopkins University for my PhD. And initially, I started off just doing pure microeconomic theory, in particular decision theory, which is sort of a very niche sub-branch of economic theory, which looks at, how do you construct a utility function? How do you represent preferences and beliefs of an economic agent, which leads to um, the sort of the this neoclassical sort of model of expected utility theory. And since then, there's been sort of generalizations of it. So that's what I sort of worked on for the first 2, 3 years of my PhD, and then I shifted towards more empirical stuff. Specifically, I looked at American politics, and particularly the effect of advertising on election outcomes in U.S. Congressional district races in the U.S. This was some. It's manageable to do this in the U.S. context because the Federal Election Commission, which is sort of the American version of our election commission, provides public units. It's publicly available. They provide data on, how much
तो
candidates are
समझ साहब, पहले तो
showing.
आपका एकेडमिक करियर तो बहुत ही कमेंडेबल है। सेंट एंड्रूज विच इज वन ऑफ द फर्स्ट यूनिवर्सिटी इन द वर्ल्ड, और उसके बाद ये आप गए वहाँ अपना जॉन्स हॉपकिंस। तो जॉन्स हॉपकिंस से बात करते हुए एक भूल ना मेरे से हो जाए,
जी,
आप अली खान से मिले कि नहीं मिले?
मैं बिल्कुल मिला जी। Actually, Ali Khan was my advisor for about the first 3 or 4 years.
अच्छा।
जब
हाँ।
तक मैं economic theory कर रहा था, I would consider him a mentor, very mercurial sort of person, a genius, I would say. I think the highest praise I can give him is कि जितनी भी मैंने mathematics सीखी है वो अली खान से मैंने सीखी है properly.
ये भी लोगों को बता दें कि अली खान साहब पाकिस्तान के सबसे बड़े इकोनॉमिस्ट थे, वन ऑफ द फर्स्ट इकोनॉमिस्ट हु रीच दैट स्टेज कि चेयर
That's right.
प्रोफेसर जॉन्स हॉपकिंस में बन गए वो। I think when we were very young, he became a chair professor at Johns Hopkins. He came first in LSE,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
he published so beautifully एक जमाने में econometrica और
जी.
every major journal he published in. But
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
said, उसकी personality बड़ी मजेदार है। You either love him or you hate him, but he's a lovely
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah.
He's a lovely guy.
No, he's a
और
wonderful man. जी.
और माशाल्लाह, फ्रॉम पोएट्री टू इकोनॉमिक्स हर चीज में उसका बड़ा अच्छा अबूर है। ही इज
जी.
समबडी दैट ऑनेस्टली पाकिस्तान शुड पे मोर ट्रिब्यूट टू। तो ये मैं कह के जॉन हॉपकिंस का नाम आया तो उसको ना हम भूल जाए। ही समबडी, उसको मैं फिर पकड़ूंगा। आई हैव डन इट बिफोर विद हिम, बट आई विल डू इट अगेन विद हिम। कि उसके साथ एक पॉडकास्ट किया जाए, उससे काफी इट्स ऑलवेज अ प्लेजर टॉकिंग टू हिम। अच्छा, तो जरा उसामा साहब, ये तो अली को आई थिंक हमें करना ही चाहिए रिकग्नाइज अपने ग्रेड्स को। तो ये करते हुए अब आप जरा डिटेल में अपना थीसिस बताइए ना कि क्या आपने
Right.
किया। हाँ।
So US American politics context में I was looking at, so this was my doctoral research.
जी।
I was looking at what the effect of advertising is on election outcomes.
हम्म,
So if I try to put it somewhat simply, imagine trying to estimate what you might call a vote production function.
हम्म,
So you want to try and estimate the determinants of the number of votes that a candidate gets who's running in a particular district, let's say the 47th district
हम्म,
of New York.
हम्म,
Perhaps I should sort of just take a step back and give a brief primer on the Electoral College of the US. So
वेरी गुड।
the it consists of the lower house and the upper house. The upper house is the Senate, which consists of 100 seats. Um, the lower house, which is the congressional district, which is the Congress, consists of 434 seats. And this is done by population. So, roughly speaking, about 700,000 people constitute one congressional district, which is why you might have, close to 100 or more congressional districts in New York State, but perhaps only one or two congressional districts in, say, Alaska or Wyoming or one of those sparsely populated states. जो congressional district term होती है जी, that's every 2 years. So now the most it's November, May, you'll have the sort of the midterm elections in the US, जिसमें congressional district races elections होंगे दोबारा. So my thesis was looking at what the effect in particular of advertising is on election outcomes. So in a sort of in a nutshell, um, if I spend X amount of money on advertising, how does that translate to votes, right? That a candidate gets. And in this context, I was actually looking at sort of three types of advertising. So when a candidate registers with the FEC, they have to register what's called a principal campaign committee. So this is sort of the campaign committee which collects all the contributions for that candidate, and spends, those contributions on various things during the election cycle.
mm,
Um, so I was looking at the amount that comes from those sort of campaign contributions, the amount that a candidate spends on advertising. And then there's what are called third-party advertising. So think of, these third-party political action committees or lobbying groups or interest groups, which spend money trying to get a particular candidate elected in a particular congressional district.
mm,
And it's maybe there's actually categorization. So these are what are called independent expenditures by the FEC.
mm,
And the nice thing is that in those independent expenditures files, there's actually a category which is called, money that's spent in support or against a particular candidate. So just as an example, think of, say, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, spending some amount of money, say, on advertising, which is in support of a particular Republican candidate in a particular district. But it could also be the NRA spending money against the Democrat candidate in the same district as well. So we can separate out these two kinds of expenditures. And so what we have are three types of expenditures. There's money that comes out of the candidate's own sort of say war chest, that they spend on advertising. And then there's two types of advertising that's done by third-party interest groups or PACs, political action
mm,
committees, that can either be against or in support
mm,
of a particular candidate. And so my goal was to look at, okay, what is the effect of these three types of advertising on election outcomes? And I measured the latter by just looking at the number of votes that they get, right?
mm, mm,
And of course, there's a lot of endogeneity issues here. You have to sort of take into account that um, candidate spending is going to be endogenous. It depends on how much money they have to play with. It depends on whether they're an incumbent or not, whether they're a challenger, right? It depends on how strong their rival is, right? So you try and sort of account for a lot of these things. So I account for, the size of campaign contributions. There might be sort of within that particular district, you've heard this term of, say, red state or blue state. Some states might be historically, much more Republican than, say, Democrats. So you have to account for that. Um, and so I use, data on demographic characteristics of districts to try and account for the latent preferences of the voters in that particular district to sort of try and account for that. Um, and so really the model boils down to estimating a system of equations. So you have, say, a pair of vote production functions, one for Democrats, one for Republicans. So I'm trying to estimate what the effect of advertising on the number of votes that a particular candidate gets. But then the fact that candidate spending is also endogenous, I sort of endogenize that by modeling that as well. So then I have a system of equations which models how much money a candidate is also spending on
mm,
advertising, right?
mm, mm,
Um,
mm,
and so what I find is that candidate spending does make a difference on advertising. Um, in terms of a sort of a short, non-technical way of showing the effect is that the cost per vote for a Democrat of advertising is about $22 on
mm,
average. And for
mm,
Republicans, it's about $32. So just this asymmetry itself is interesting. The fact that Republicans on average have to spend more for that additional vote than
mm,
Democrats. This is consistent with the literature in political science in the US, which sort of estimates that
mm,
the the premium that Republican advertising consulting agencies charge is about 30 cents on the dollar. So that sort of is consistent with that. The more interesting result that comes out is that actually third-party advertising practically has no effect on election outcomes. Once you
mm,
take into account the size of campaign contributions, incumbency effect, and how much spending is being done by the candidate themselves, right? So that's very interesting. And I think it has some welfare implications as well. So just a bit of history. Before 2010, there was a limit set by the FEC on how much third-party interest groups could spend in an election campaign. And then there was in 2010, there was a Supreme Court ruling. This is called the Citizens United Act of 2010, which removed that limit, which removed that limit. And so I was looking at post 2010, you see this huge surge of money being thrown at both Democrats and Republicans during this election, during each election cycle, right? Um, but the effect, at least my models suggest that the effect on actual election outcomes is practically negligible. Um, and so my explanation for that is that I think what since 2010, what has tended to happen is what you might call sort of a tit for tat or an arms race, right? So if I'm a Democrat candidate and I have a third party interest group or a super PAC which is funding me, or funding my advertising on TV or radio, whatever, there's an incentive for the rival super PAC or PAC to fund their Republican candidate, right? So it's almost like this arms race where the more a particular candidate spends, or the PACs that are supporting a particular candidate, the more that they spend, the rational response is for the other party to also spend more. And so I think there's sort of this neutralizing effect.
पर
Um,
देखिए ये जो है ना यू सेइंग एक चीज तो अमेरिका की वाजे है जो एवरीबडी सीम्स टू नो कि जी रेड स्टेट्स और ब्लू स्टेट्स तो ऑलमोस्ट कमिटेड है और बहुत कम स्विंग करते हैं ठीक है
जी
तो आप मेजर कर रहे हैं द मार्जिनल इम्पैक्ट मतलब रेड स्टेट तो रेड स्टेट ही रहेगा अब ये जो एडवर्टाइजमेंट है ये क्या रेड स्टेट को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रही है या ब्लू स्टेट को क्या कर रही है जो आप जो मार्जिनल इफेक्ट मेजर कर रहे हैं आप इफेक्ट मेजर कर रहे हैं कि स्टेट तो रेड है अब मार्जिनल
हाँ
वोटर को क्या असर पड़ता है तो क्या ये वाकई कुछ स्विंग होती है कि नहीं होती क्योंकि हमारे
so
जो पड़ता है स्विंग नहीं होती
Gigi, we should be a bit careful here because even within a state that might be traditionally considered red or blue, for example, take Pennsylvania, for example,
हम्म,
which is, up jacket
हम्म,
throws, so perhaps it's a bit of a swing state, but there might
हम्म,
be areas of that state which are predominantly Democrat. For example, look at urban areas, right?
हम्म,
So look at, say, Pittsburgh City in Pennsylvania or Philadelphia. But if you go to the rural areas, those might be more Republican, right? So
जी
that's the advantage of, and that's what you have to look at when you look at congressional districts, because even within a particular state,
बिल्कुल
they might vary, right, depending on whether the area is rural or urban. And
जी
so that's why it's very important to look at the demographic characteristics of that district. What's the median income level?
हम्म,
What's the racial composition, right? Now, if you look at, for example, just to sort of tie it in, if you look at the last presidential election in the U.S.,
हम्म,
there was this historically it was considered that racial minorities, say Latinos, or they tend to vote Democrat, right? That was sort of considered an established sort of wisdom of the community. That sort of changed, right? So the point of this is to say that you can try and account for whether a district is historically red or blue by looking at the demographic characteristics of that district, because those tend to be very well correlated with how the district ends up voting.
अच्छा ये जो है कि जो एथनिक ग्रुप्स हैं दे
जी
में फेवर द डेमोक्रेट्स एंड दी वो मेगा जो है जो वाइट
हाँ जी
रिपब्लिकन है
हाँ
दे
जी
में
हाँ जी हाँ
तो
जी
क्या उनको भी एडवर्टाइजमेंट इन्फ्लुएंस कर लेती है कि नहीं करती या दे
um,
रिमेन फिक्स्ड
so I haven't looked at, this is a good question. So I haven't looked at specifically
राइट
how advertising affects particular ethnic groups. Part of the reason for that is that you don't have a lot of variation. So, you're looking at ethnic minorities, say
राइट
blacks or Latinos, but in a lot of districts, they might comprise maybe say 1 or 2% of the total
राइट
voting population, right? So there's not too much to play with. So I look at sort of on average, what's the effect? But that's a good question to ask and perhaps that's a topic for a further paper down the road.
रिसर्च
Yeah,
अच्छा
how
ये
you
ये
look at
ये मैं लोगों को बताता हूँ असल चीज ये है कि व्हेन यू हैव सम रिसर्च it doesn't solve all questions. In
Yeah,
fact,
yeah,
research raises more questions. Good research raises more questions than it solves. And
that's right.
that's a human condition. It's got nothing to do with research.
Yeah,
Humanity is supposed to be a problem-solving species, so we'll always have problems to solve.
yeah.
तो ये जो आपने बात की थी, एक और बात बताएं कि ये जो है आई मीन ये हमारी जो एक फीलिंग है बाहर से बैठे हुए जो हम मीडिया पे भी देखते हैं कि मनी कंट्रोल्स इलेक्शंस, हाउ करेक्ट इज दैट?
Um, So I think in the US, it's steadily, the influence of money has steadily gotten bigger and bigger. So if you look at, say, since the 80s and onwards, there's, you see, if you were to just sort of do a time trend of how much, what's the average amount of money that that a winning candidate is spending, that's steadily gone up, even if you look at it in real terms. So, and especially after 2010 with the Citizens United Act, up to the limit भी चली गई है, so you can, a PAC can throw as much money as it wants, right? You saw that in the last election with the amount of money that Elon Musk spent, on Trump's presidential campaign, right? So I do think that there is the effect is there in the US. It has steadily been increasing, and there are, I think, some political scientists in the US that think that it's actually just dominated. So the most extreme sort of rendition of what's happening in the US is that actually corporate America has taken over the politics in the US. And you see this in particular, you can see this in the congressional district because if a candidate is receiving money from a particular PAC and they end up being elected, that will tend to affect how they will vote on certain bills that come up, right, in Congress. And so I think that's really the mechanism, right? It's almost like a quid pro quo, a PAC is throwing money at a particular candidate and they get elected and they say, well, and recall also that the congressional district term is only 2 years. So every 2 years, these guys are up for re-election. And so that's not a lot of time, right? So as soon as they come into power or they get elected, they're already prepping for the next, almost the next election cycle. And so I think it's fair to say that the effect is there and steadily it's gotten more and more pervasive.
तो फिर जब पैसा इन्वॉल्व हो जाए, व्हाट रोल डू आइडियाज प्ले? अगर के फॉर एग्जांपल जो हमारी डेमोक्रेसी की डेफिनेशन दैट वी थिंक ऑफ वो ये है कि जी मैं आ रहा हूँ कह के जी हमने लोगों की खुशहाली करनी है, आप आ रहे हैं कि हमने एक्सपोर्ट बढ़ानी है, कोई मतलब कोई ऐसा चीज है, या आप आ रहे हैं कि मैंने प्रोविंसेस बनाने हैं और मैं कहता हूँ नहीं जी हमने लोकल कम। हम सोचते हैं जो वोटिंग है वो एक आइडियाज की जंग है। हम एक प्लेटफॉर्म पेश करते हैं और इन द आइडियल सर्कमस्टांसिस लोग वोट करते हैं एक प्लेटफॉर्म के लिए, उससे वो जनरल वेल जो है निकलती है और माशाल्लाह डेमोक्रेसी बड़ी अच्छी चलती है। तो अगर पैसे से डेमोक्रेसी चल रही है तो ये तो थोड़ा सा परेशानी की बात नहीं है?
I think hey. I mean, you might say that there have been some nice counterexamples. You look at the recent uh, जो मेयर की कैंपेन थी न्यूयॉर्क में जो ममदानी जीते, right? So I think that might be considered a bit of a counter example. Although I'm pretty sure Mamdani collected a lot of money as well. I mean, it takes money to run a campaign, right? So that goes without saying. In terms of ideas, yeah, I think that's a problem. I mean, so just to sort of add to that, when I came back to Pakistan, when I joined LUMS, after finishing my doctorate and doing a postdoc in the US, my work sort of naturally transitioned towards looking at, Pakistani politics. And so I asked the question, "Cha, can I try and replicate the same kind of thing I did in the US for the US data? Can I do it for, say, National Assembly elections, right?" Of course, there's a paucity of data. It's not available नहीं होता data FEC says, so you hear anecdotes about how much crores it takes to win a seat, right, here in Pakistan, but you don't have hard data to go by. Um, and so I think my sense now is G, ke, you know in economic theory we have these very nice simplistic cute models which look at what would happen in equilibrium when you have candidates running on different manifestos or different campaigns. One might be very left leaning, one might be right leaning, right? And so if you're familiar, there's something called the median voter theorem, which says that if assuming that everybody votes and the distribution of voters along this ideological scale is uniform, right? So there are as many voters on the left as there are on the right. In equilibrium, both candidates will converge to the center, right? So you'll have in equilibrium, you'll have
बिकॉज
candidates.
जो पॉपुलेशन है उसकी जो ख्यालात हैं वो वोट से इजहार करके हर किसी को एक एक कॉमन लेवल पे ले आएंगे जो पॉपुलेशन सोच रही है। तो हम
Yeah, yeah,
मेरा ख्याल है
exactly.
कि हर कैंडिडेट हर चीज कौम की जो आवाज है वो पूरी सुनी जाएगी।
Yeah,
ये
So this is one very, I think, simplistic and unrealistic assumption, right? That the mechanism is such that the opinion of the marginal or the median voter will somehow be pivotal, or it translates into actually what happens.
हाँ,
Um, and more recently, I've come to this realization that I think these sorts of models are just they're not appropriate for the Pakistani context. One, because the mechanism itself is broken. So it's not really the case that how people vote actually translates to who wins or who gets elected, right? So that completely. So I think I've been telling colleagues as well for the past year and a half, jab se 26th or 27th Amendment, I've been saying to them, I kind of feel like doing game theory or trying to look at these sorts of situations, this phenomena from a game theoretic perspective is futile because, the underlying assumption of any sort of game theoretic model is that the rules are set and everybody plays by the rules of the game that's set, right? That's what defines the game, is that what the rules of the game are. And we've seen, I think, that that's just completely gone out the window in Pakistan, right? Nobody knows what the rules of the game are, right? Or if the rules of the game are defined for a certain moment, they can be completely violated in the next moment, right? So my sense now is, coming back to your original question, I think more I found it's more useful perhaps to think about what's happening in Pakistan, the what's happening politically in Pakistan, from almost from a perspective of what kind of coalitions are forming, and looking at what happens in terms of the election outcome level, seeing that as the result of some sort of coalitional bargaining process that takes place between players that have power, um, you know. Um, and so I think that's perhaps a useful or more fruitful approach that one might take towards looking at. But in terms of what you were saying, Pele, about ideas, I think we're living in a world now where it's become globally bhi aap dekhengi, I think it's become less and less so important about what actual ideas are. It's more about how you. I mean, you look at the whole Trump phenomena as well. He will say one thing and then completely contradict him in the next breath, right? And in some sense, it's almost become legitimized because people will still show up and he's still there, and people are taking him seriously.
अच्छा, let me segue from here to अपना political economy. You would describe yourself as a political economist, right? You've done political economy, mashallah, you've done
Broadly
very well in
construed,
that.
हाँ,
ठीक
looking
है
at
जी,
questions
बिल्कुल ठीक।
as
तो जरा प्लीज बता दीजिए ये पॉलिटिकल
an
इकोनॉमी जो है ना टर्म पाकिस्तान
intersection
में
of
बड़े
economics
लूजली
and
यूज
politics.
होती है। हाँ, बड़े लूजली यूज होती है। मैं देखता हूँ हर टीवी एंकर भी रोज लगा होता है ये पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी है,
हाँ,
पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी है। जरा प्लीज एज एज एन एक्सपर्ट इन दिस सब्जेक्ट आप जरा हमें डिफाइन कर दें पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी होती क्या है और इसका जो सोचने का तरीका क्या है। ये छोड़ दें हमारे एंकर्स जो
uh,
कहते हैं हर बंदा एक्सपर्ट बना हुआ है पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी, आप जरा बताइए डिटेल में ये क्या होती है चीज।
I'm a student of political economy, just like I think a lot of other people. I think I should also add over here that political economy is understood differently depending on the academic discipline. I think if you were to speak to any of my colleagues in the political science department at LUMS, they would understand political economy differently than how or the way that I think about political economy broadly construed is to think about um, questions that are relevant at the intersection of both economics and politics. Uh, And the approach that I take, which I think the approach that the discipline of orthodox economics takes, is to think about those questions from the perspective of that people respond to incentives. And that's sort of like cornerstone of new classical economic theory, is that people have incentives and you can try and understand and sometimes you can predict economic behavior or human behavior by looking at trying to understand their incentives. Um, and so that's how I sort of look at it. Perhaps it's not a very good or very precise notion of political economy, but that's how I like to think about political economy, is trying to think about the incentives that underline decisions made by political actors in the perspective of a particular economic system or an economy.
हम्म। तो इसमें हमें कोई एग्जांपल दें जो सबसे आपके फेवरेट पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमिस्ट जो प्रोफेशन में है।
Uh, I don't know if I have a favorite political economist. I think so if you look at, for example, the work that's done by Jean Tirole, the French economist, the Nobel Prize winner, right? I think his approach and his co-authors, that's really sort of pushed the discipline, or at least the modeling or the theorizing forward in terms of trying to understand um, uh, economic phenomena and also political phenomena from the perspective of almost like a principal agent problem. What do I mean by a principal agent problem? Um, there's a principal, a person who cares about something. Think about a manager, think about, say, the prime minister, right? And there's an agent who works for this principal and he tries to get some outcome. He has to put in some effort to get some outcome which affects the principal, right? So, classic example, think of a prime minister who uh, uh, um, hires an advisor for a particular sector. The advisor is supposed to do some work, some effort to give some policy prescription, perhaps. The main differences between the principal and the advisor and the agent is that there's an asymmetry of information. So the advisor might have access to certain information that the principal does not, right?
पर इस सवाल को दूसरी तरफ से तो हम देख सकते हैं ना। द प्रिंसिपल ऑफ द पीपल, द प्राइम मिनिस्टर इज द एजेंट।
Sure. Yes,
इतना
that's
हाँ,
good. It's good. Yeah.
है
So
ना।
that's also another nice example of that.
हाँ,
Yes. Yes.
कि
Yes.
आफ्टर ऑल प्राइम मिनिस्टर तो लोगों के लिए काम कर रहा है ना, तो प्राइम मिनिस्टर के इंसेंटिव्स और वो वहां प्रिंसिपल एजेंट हमारे आजकल इलिस्ट्रेट हो रहा है बड़ा अच्छा कि हमारे यहाँ जो प्रिंसिपल तो लोग हैं, अब
हाँ
एजेंट कौन है। और वो एजेंट में हाइब्रिड आ गया और हाइब्रिड में फिर वेरियस अब लोगों की जो वो जनरल विल जो आप कह रहे थे, सॉरी जो मीडियन वोटर कह रहे थे आप, कि जो लोगों की राय है या लोगों की कॉमन आप मिला ले राय, वो किस हद तक इम्प्लीमेंट हो रही है या किस हद तक इलस्ट्रेट कर रही है इन द एजेंट्स बिहेवियर। ये तो
हाँ
पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त चल रहा है सिस्टम। चले, एक तो ये प्रिंसिपल एजेंट फ्रेमवर्क आपने बता दिया जहां के एक एक ओनर है और एक उसका नौकर है जो उसके लिए काम कर रहा है, ठीक है, और उसकी
yeah.
इंसेंटिव्स क्या हैं और क्या चीज है। दूसरा वो बुकैनन वगैरह का भी तो है ना फ्रेमवर्क, वो बताइए वो क्या है।
So I have to be very honest to you, because came into this field somewhat accidentally. I'm not very familiar. I think probably आपको बेहतर पता होगा इसके बारे में. Perhaps you can enlighten me much more than the other way around.
नहीं, वो तो ये कहते हैं कि कॉस्ट बेनिफिट एनालिसिस है कि जो भी लोगों की वो इंटरेस्ट में है चीज, उसका कॉस्ट बेनिफिट एनालिसिस रफली स्पीकिंग आप करके और आप उसमें बना सकते हैं कि क्या चीज निकलेगी क्या नहीं निकलेगी, ठीक है। सो लोग देखते हैं अपना मुफाद, वेरियस वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट अपना मुफाद देखते हैं और उधर से वो निकालते हैं, एक निकल आती है चीज कि क्या होगी। तो एक
Do you think the same thing is can also be rephrased as just saying कि incentives क्या है लोगों के,
नहीं, पर
and
वहां
people respond to
आई थिंक
incentives?
थोड़ा सा वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट के आ जाते हैं ना। अब यहाँ जैसे हो रहा है, अब जो कार मैन्युफैक्चरर्स के वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट हैं या
हाँ sure.
टेक्सटाइल माफिया के वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट हैं, वो जरूरी तो नहीं कि आपके मेरे हैं, और वो जरूरी तो नहीं कि लोगों के भी हैं। अब उनको
हाँ
प्रोटेक्शन मिली हुई है, वो प्रोटेक्शन और सब्सिडी के लिए वो लड़ रहे हैं, तो वो
yeah
भी
yeah
चलेगा वहां, ठीक है ना।
yes
तो
yes
एक वो है इंटरेस्ट ग्रुप की जो है थियरी, ये ऑल्सन की भी बड़े लोगों की है, ये है कि जी इंटरेस्ट ग्रुप अपने मुफाद के लिए लड़ते हैं। जैसे अमरीका में भी है, अमरीका में अब ये जो लॉबी है स्मोकिंग की या गन लॉबी है,
हाँ yes yes
आई थिंक कोई अगर पोल्स देखें तो बहुत सारे लोग चाहते हैं कि गन लॉबी को खत्म कर दिया जाए,
हाँ, श्योर, राइट।
बट
राइट।
लॉबी की पावर इतनी है कि वो खत्म
हाँ।
नहीं हो सकती, ठीक है ना। तो ये
हाँ।
भी एक चीज है। तो इसके लिए अब लॉबी की पावर को कैसे खत्म करें, बहुत मुश्किल बात है। बट लॉबी विल इन्फ्लुएंस द गवर्नमेंट, एंड
ऑफ कोर्स।
इसलिए वो ये कहते हैं कि जितनी गवर्नमेंट कम हो उतना अच्छा है। और
हाँ,
बेहतर है कि
that's one good reason for saying the size of the government should be small. Yes,
हाँ,
yes.
हाँ,
I think coming back to what, and perhaps trying to connect what I was talking about with what you're saying is, with the classical principal agent problem, the
हम्म,
principal wants to maximize his objective function. Here I'm using economics jargon, but I think
बिल्कुल
it's
ठीक।
appropriate for our conversation. The principal wants to maximize his objective function, whatever it is. And one variable that goes into that objective function is what the agent is doing. But the agent has to think about two things. One, he has to participate in the program itself, right? So this is what's called a participation constraint, right? Um, and the principal also cares about the agent trying his best in a sense, right? Trying to put the maximum amount of effort, right? Um, and that's what we usually refer to as incentive compatibility, right? So either the agent is getting enough from the principal that he doesn't have any incentive to shirk, right? Do something else. Dandini marega, right? That's one thing. And the participation constraint is saying, yaar, ki the what the principal is initially offering the agent to come work for him is enough for the agent to actually come and work and not go do something else, right? So I think if you phrase it in this way, I think another nice example is, we talk about, you've talked about this a lot, I think, in your other sort of seminars and during your time at PIDE as well, about how we could improve bureaucracy and how we could uh, incentivize good people to come and work, right? And one very simplistic answer is to say, "यार के salaries बढ़ाते हैं," right? So that's an example of, say, trying to meet the participation constraint, right? So if a good guy, if a good worker, intelligent guy, if he's getting, say, ₹1 million working in the corporate sector, one response, rational response, is to say, "यार कि अच्छा, if you want to try and pull him into the public sector, just try and match his pay grade," right? So that's one aspect. The second aspect is again going back to the incentive compatibility issue, right? So you have to figure out, okay, I've gotten the guy to come and work for me, but how do I make sure that he does not shirk, right? So how do I make sure that in some sense, his incentives, which will motivate him to work the way he works, his incentives are aligned with my own incentives, right? So that he puts in the effort that the way I want, I want him to
पर
work.
आपने ये जो बातें की ना, आई थिंक दिस इज वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग। थ्री थिंग्स दैट यू मेंशन: पार्टिसिपेशन कंस्ट्रेंट, इंसेंटिव कैपेबिलिटी एंड एसिमेट्रिक इंफॉर्मेशन।
Yeah.
अगर हम तीनों चीजों को मिलाएं तो इन अ वेरी लूज सेंस ये तो फ्रेमवर्क बन जाता है कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का या लॉज का। अगर आप
Huh.
सोचें तो जो एजेंट है, फॉर एग्जांपल अगर प्राइम मिनिस्टर एजेंट है या मैं वट रिप्रेजेंटेटिव हूँ, एजेंट हूँ, अब मेरे पास बड़ी अपॉर्चुनिटी है कि मैं पैसे चुरा लूं, जिस विच इज करप्शन, ठीक है।
Yeah.
तो मेरा एक इंसेंटिव है बड़ा अच्छा, अनलेस यू हैव अ फ्रेमवर्क आउट देयर दैट मॉनिटर्स मी एंड वगैरह, ठीक है ना।
हाँ।
तो मैं
हाँ।
पैसे चुरा के भाग जाऊंगा। दूसरी चीज ये है, जो आप पार्टिसिपेशन की बात करें तो वहां अगेन डिपेंड करता है कि आप अच्छे बंदे ला रहे हैं कि नहीं ला रहे हैं। तो आप
Yep.
कैसे डिफाइन करते हैं? एक तो तनख्वाह है, पर दूसरी चीजें भी हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल बिहेवियरल इकोनॉमिक्स बताती है कि कुछ लोग हैं जो बड़े मोटिवेटेड होते हैं और चाहते हैं कुछ काम करना, या उनको शौक होता है काम का, या उनको शौक होता है अपनी शोहरत बनाने का वगैरह। तो यू कैन प्ले
Sure.
ऑन मैनी मैनी एवेन्यू, सिर्फ पैसा नहीं और एवेन्यूज भी हैं।
Yes.
जैसे कि
Yes.
मैं हमेशा कहता हूँ कि बरतानिया ने कमाल किया था अपने जमाने में कि वो आपके नाम के आगे 3 लफ्ज लगा देते थे और आप उसके लिए मर जाते थे, वो सर लगा देते थे, ऐसा है, मर जाते। हमने तमगों को एक मजाक बना दिया है, तो किसी को अब तमगे के लिए काम करने का कोई फायदा नहीं है, ठीक है।
Uh,
तो अब मसला ये है कि अगर हम सोचें इससे भी बैक इनटू द जो दूसरी स्ट्रैंड ऑफ लिटरेचर कह रही है कि इंस्टीट्यूशंस आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, व्हिच इज
yes. Yes.
थिंग्स लाइक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन वगैरह वगैरह। तो इस पे रोशनी डालें ना कि प्रिंसिपल एजेंट फ्रेमवर्क इज वेरी गुड, आई अप्रिशिएट दैट, बड़ी अच्छी बात कर रहे हैं कि वेरी गुड वे टू थिंक, बट इट्स स्टिल विद इन द within two parties. But we are operating
Yes,
in a complex world.
yes, you're
तो
right. You're right. जी, sorry, go
उसके
ahead.
अंदर हम ये खास तौर पे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल इकोनॉमिक्स वगैरह हम आ जाए, म्यूलर और वो कूटर वगैरह की बातें और हायक की वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ लिबर्टी या क्या, अगर हम देखें तो उस तरफ अगर हम चलें तो what does the literature tell us about constitution making and about setting up a governance framework using the three things that you said? Incentive compatibility क्या होती है? वो ये होती है कि हम दोनों, हमारे जो मुफाद हैं वो ऐसे सेट हो जाए कि काम हो सकता है, ठीक है ना, हमारे
Yes.
मुफाद मिल जाए। तो अगर हम
Right.
इन तीन चीजों को डालें बीच में, आपकी क्या राय है एज अ पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमिस्ट? क्या, हाउ शुड वी थिंक ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन और द लीगल फ्रेमवर्क और द इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क?
Yeah, good question. It's there's a lot to unpack here, so I'll try and stumble my way through it.
चलो।
So I think in terms of the discipline itself, the academy of what we call the academy of economics, I think not a lot of attention has been paid to this point. I think in development economics, more recently, there's some people have done some work on this. My colleagues at LUMS would know a lot more about particular names. Who worked on this. But I think, if you go back to, for example, the classical growth model, जो solo का हमें पढ़ाया जाता था, right? And it's still sort of, even in a 200 level undergraduate course in macro, you start with the solo growth model. There's no, in that model, there's nothing corresponding to what you're calling the institution, right? It's almost as a given, yeah, the government is what it is, it works as it does, and that's it. It could be called a simplifying assumption, but I think there's more to it. Because the later work in development economics has, as I think shown, it tried to show that institutional setups do matter, right? The question of governance, right, and how governance affects growth, for example, right? Those are important things. So I think more recently, and again, because this is not my field exactly, so I'm not that well versed in, but I do think more recently there has been work which uh, tries to emphasize that the role of institutions is important when you're looking at macro indicators like growth, human capital development, this kind of stuff. Those are important. But at the same time, I do also get the sense that that's still very much a very small community. So I don't think that has translated, those insights have sort of transferred or been cemented into these other disciplines. For example, I think among macroeconomists, they still don't sort of take it that seriously. I think wo jo aap baat kar rahe hain about the role of institutions, it's very much in the it's taken from the framework of sort of a micro approach to looking at growth, right? Whereas if you talk to macroeconomists, I had an advisor at Johns Hopkins who said to me, the problem with our discipline is that it's very compartmentalized, right? So like, and we're also very, very proud with our own sort of sub-discipline, right? So I'm a microeconomist, I'm a macroeconomist, I'm an econometrician, right? And as soon as you put yourself in a box, it's almost like you don't even want to consider what the other boxes have to offer, right? So I think from the discipline point of view, I think वो एक थोड़ा सा issue है. I do think there's work that's been done on it, which has to be explored further, I think, and we're all sort of guilty of not looking at that more deeply. Coming back to what you were saying, the original question about the role of the institution, role of the constitution, right? I think setting it up as a principal agent problem is there's a lot of problems with that. One, वो जो आप पहले बात कर रहे थे यार, if the principal is the population, the electorate, how do you aggregate the preferences of the electorate into a single one, right? So that's a bit of an issue, right? Um, and if the agent are the elected representatives, then how do you try and incentivize that the representatives are actually following through on what the preferences of the electorate is, right? Um, Assuming that we have a good summary measure of what the preferences of the electorate are. One approach is to say, yeah, let's try and cut the distance between the principal and the agent, right? And that might translate to something as simple as trying to bring local government as local as you can go, right? So you should have local you should have mayors for every town which are elected so that they're actually directly answerable to the population that's affected by their decisions, right? Um, so one sort of diagnosis of the problem over here is that there's just too much of a disconnect between the principal, the electorate, and the agent, which are our elected representatives, right? And that further leads to that misalignment of incentives, which then creates the mess that we see. So I'm not sure, Ji, about what's the as I said before. I think in the context of Pakistan, because there's such a big disconnect between the people that get elected and the actual the principle, as you were saying. Because there's such a big disconnect, perhaps the what I think an alternate approach would be to think about this is, how government gets formed, and who gets what is just a function of a bargaining process that takes place between the players of the game, where the players of the game are just the people in who have certain political authority and power. And so, in that sense, you cut out the population entirely, right?
mm, mm,
And so, in the context of, say, Pakistan, you might think of the players as being, the politicians, the civilian and non-civilian administrators of the country. The civilian administrators might include members of bureaucracy, might include members of the judiciary, as well as the military. And so you might think of, okay, really what's happening is just this bargaining process, this bargaining game that's played between these players, that leads that then that trickles down, and then you sort of see what's happening on the ground, and you try to interpret what's happening on the ground as a result of some big game, that's the coalitional game that's being played between these players. So that's my way of thinking about trying
No,
to
but I
truly
think I
understand
think
this.
that's a very important way of looking at it. It's a great way कि जी if we think of again जो आपने शुरू में बात की थी गेम थेरेटिक हो जाता है थोड़ा सा कि जी there are a number of groups that are at play here. Going
Hmm.
back to the vested interest theory कि जी number of groups at play here, not just ये bureaucracy, judiciary, etc., the army, but then there are political interest, sorry, the economic interest too. For example, the businessman lobby. Within that, there are groups that are playing the
Hmm.
IPP lobby, the automobile lobby, etc., and then the farmers lobby. So there's lots of lobbies at play. So maybe it's the lobbies. Election एक साइड पे चीज है जो कुछ कर रही है निकाल रही है जनरल विल, but then lobbies also superimposed on that.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
अगर इसको हम सोचें और दूसरी तरफ वो प्रिंसिपल एजेंट प्रॉब्लम चल रहा है, it becomes very complex and there are many different mechanisms that work here. तो अगर आप इसको सोचें, now you are mashallah directing research and you got people that you're supervising etc as well. और मैं आई एम होपिंग कि मेरी ऑडियंस में बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट्स सुन रहे होंगे ताकि होल पॉइंट इज कि वो इसमें से रिसर्च आइडियाज निकाले. तो आप क्या रिकमेंड करेंगे इन टर्म्स ऑफ सेटिंग अप, लेट्स से इफ यू आर एडवाइजिंग स्टूडेंट्स, आप जो विच यू आर डूइंग इन एनी केस कि जी आ रहे हैं आपका स्टूडेंट्स के सर मुझे टॉपिक बताएं, मैं कुछ काम करूं ये वो. तो लेट्स से इफ वी वर सिटिंग डाउन टुगेदर एंड डिजाइनिंग अ रिसर्च एजेंडा कि जी इस एरिया में हमने यहाँ काम करना है, तो क्या किस किस्म के क्वेश्चंस रेज करेंगे आप जो लोग अपनी जिस पे रिसर्च करें फॉर एग्जांपल.
Um, so my always when a student comes to me, my first question is, yeah, what is it really that interests you, right? Because I think it's the internal motivation that will drive the work and the
फेयर
effort,
पॉइंट.
right?
फेयर
So
पॉइंट.
first thing
पर
is to
मेरे जैसे स्टूडेंट्स भी आ जाते हैं ना जिनके पास कोई आइडिया नहीं, कहते यार बता दे.
no, no, you're being, I think, slightly facetious, Ajay. I think you have a lot of interesting ideas. So I think that's the first thing, is to figure out, yeah, what is it that the student really wants to sort
फेयर
of
पॉइंट.
ask. And then once you sort of try and figure that out, the second question is, okay, what kind of tools are appropriate to answering that question, right? And so using a principal agent framework might work for a particular question, but not for other questions. Using a coalitional game theoretic approach might work in some situations, but not in other situations, right? So I think it's sort of this two, you know, tier process where first you have to figure out what's the important question that really that you're willing to sacrifice sleep for, right, to work on it. The second is then trying to figure out the appropriate. And I'm not sort of a monist about, yeah, okay, there's only one methodology that works for everything. I mean, I think one sort of issue with this is taking a step back. I think one um, uh, in I think in Pakistan, at least maybe this is just a local effect. I don't know, but there has tended to be an emphasis on a particular methodological approach in economics when it comes to doing empirical work. Yeah, RCT kara do, right? I think there's a whole political economy surrounding that as well, right? On why people do a lot of RCTs over here. There's, I think, generally बहुत कम appetite है for doing purely theoretical work. The kind of work that we've just been talking about trying to model principle, trying to model, say, the political structure of Pakistan as a principal agent problem or some other kind of approach. Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that generally our baseline level is quite low in the sense that it takes a lot to bring a student up to speed on the mathematics, the methodology, what goes into doing this kind of work. So I think that's a bit of an issue over there. So I don't know. I don't think I've answered your question in terms of, well, in my mind, I say, let the student talk about what it is that interests them, and then with the supervisor or collection of supervisors, you can try and arrive at a sensible, hopefully a sensible way of trying to answer that question. And it's not the case that it's one approach fits all sort of thing. You have to figure out what approach you want to take, depending
Fair
on the
enough.
question.
So tell me now, what areas are you researching in now?
So I'm very much continuing with my work on both American and Pakistani politics. So I'm looking at, in the context of U.S. politics, I'm sort of looking at a much more expanded data set, which has taken a while to put together, but trying to address the same sorts of questions. In the case of Pakistan, I don't think anybody's done this before, but I've been trying to put together a data set where you can actually construct a demographic profile of National Assembly constituencies. You see, इसमें एक बड़ा issue ये है कि in the case of Pakistan, so America, it's very easy because they already have this kind of, the American Community Survey has data on the actual congressional districts, right? Um, when you want to go to in the Pakistani context, in the National Assembly, for example, you don't have the same kind of data available. Why is that? The problem is that the National Assembly constituency doesn't map on one-to-one with any kind of administrative level. So आपका जो census होता है, that's conducted at the administrative unit level, right? So तहसील सब तहसील डिस्ट्रिक्ट तहसील सब तहसील फिर मौजा लेवल पे होता है राइट but it doesn't map one to one with any National Assembly constituency. So take for example Islamabad, which is now has three constituencies that sort of overlaps with multiple Mozas, right? So that's been a bit of that's part of what I've been working on with some very talented undergraduate students at LUMS, trying to put together a data set. I think the first of its kind for at least the 2018 election cycle, and then trying to do that sort of thing, sort of trying to construct, say, a vote production function for uh, uh, political parties in Pakistan, right? As a kind of almost a predictive model for predicting, how many votes a particular party might get in a particular constituency. So that's one sort of line of work that I'm doing. I've also sort of dabbled a bit with some students on sort of environmental economics stuff, but really my sort of first love has always been sort of theory. So a lot of my other work just looks at developing theoretical models of preferences, of beliefs. How can we extend the sort of standard neoclassical model of utility, the expected utility model? How can we extend it in different ways? and try and find interesting connections with other branches of microeconomic theory. And so a lot of it is a lot of my theoretical work is sort of focused around decision theory, social choice theory. How can we come up with mechanisms of social aggregation or social preference aggregation, or of trying to construct a good social welfare function. So that's the other kind of stuff that I'm doing. Just to close on one thought that I skipped on your previous question about when you were talking about institutions and the role of the Constitution. I think it's important for economists or students of economics to not just study economics but also other disciplines. I keep being reminded of this famous quote by Keynes. Perhaps you're familiar with this, where Keynes said, a good economist is not just an economist, but he's also a mathematician, a philosopher, a historian, right? And I think in a lot of our training, and I think we're guilty of this as teachers of economics at Pakistan, but also I think in the US as well, uh, we've become somewhat, we've developed this carpal tunnel of just trying to understand the mathematics, right? Without focusing as much on, say, the historical context of how the discipline developed, historical context of the question it is that you're asking, the sociological context, right? So I think those things are also important. And of course, training in philosophy to think critically, ask the right questions, that's important. Just on the last bit about your question about the role of constitution and why I mentioned philosophy, I almost think of what's happening politically from a contractarian perspective, right? In the sense of the the political order is in some sense a relationship between the state and the people, and it's like this tacit contract that's written. So that's what I refer to as a social contractarian tradition. And I think my sense is over the last year or two, ever since the 26th and 27th Amendment have been passed, I think that social contract has just completely disappeared, right? And I think that's really the fundamental problem is that, and that's why you see this big disconnect. So it's this, the social contract is gone in this country, right? I talked to colleagues about, a lot of colleagues, talked about yourself as well. You also in your work before as well, you always pushed on this point about growth, growth, growth. How can we get growth, right? And that's a legitimate question because we still have a population growth rate of something like 3%. So we have to grow to provide jobs for these kids. Um, but there are multiple ways of growing, right? You've got the European model of growth, it's built on this democratic system, right? But you've also got this Chinese model of growth, which I think the Western discipline hasn't paid as much attention to. It's more, in some sense, it's an outlier in the sense of how rapidly they've been able to bring this many people out of poverty, right? But it's based on a system in which the social contract is very different from the traditional Western democratized social contract edition, right? And you might have murmurings. Now people are saying, no, maybe we should try and adopt this Chinese model of growth where you've got an authoritarian state, um, and, and that, you work on that premise. And my response to that is, that's fine, except that in some sense that for the Chinese, that social contract has worked in the sense of the state said, look, we'll take a lot of your individual liberties, a lot of your individual rights. Give us enough time and we'll give you, peace, prosperity, um, property rights and all of this stuff. And it's worked. It's taken 30 years. It's taken a lot of people dying as well, perhaps, but it's worked. Um, I'm not so confident. So I think that's where we are now, where the social contract has to be in some sense rewritten. And my worry is that instead of converging to like a Chinese model, we might be converging to almost like a North Korean model. That's my worry. So just, I know this was a bit long-winded, but I just wanted to put
No,
that.
no, fascinating. Look, there's so many questions that arise there, but I don't think we can go on that long. But expect we'll sit down and have a conversation. I think very important, Chiza. What you said about the Chinese model raises a very interesting question. It goes back to your participation constraint.
हाँ
The Chinese defined the participation constraint through a revolution. So they self-selected those people who were committed to making things happen. And they still have a model of self-selection that seems to work, where
यस
merit happens. But हमारे मुल्क में तो आपने ये तमगों से देख लिया है कि क्या हमारा
हाँ
हमारा सिलेक्शन मॉडल है, ठीक है ना? और आपने
हाँ
हमारी इलेक्शन में भी देख लिया हाइब्रिड सिस्टम, हमारा सिलेक्शन मॉडल क्या? सो if the principal cannot select agents properly and the agents can hijack the system, I don't know where we're going. But let me turn in another direction. You mentioned something which is very important, which is close to my heart. My puzzle very frequently is, or puzzle, I should say, कि जी, I've seen a sort of social contract की आपने बात की, social contract philosophers, economists, etc., influence economic policy in a big way all over the world, or I would say even further. The Constitution was designed through the works of Hobbes, Hume, etc., etc.
यस 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 यस
इसी
यस
तरह बहुत सारी जो आपकी वेलफेयर सिस्टम्स आए वगैरह डिजाइन. So intellectuals, in my worldview, maybe I'm wrong, have led the debate, and that has filtered into activism and has filtered into finally politics over time. And lots of history to suggest that, although I'm not saying it's a complete theory, but there it is. And अभी जो वो खैर, तो ये हो गया एक चीज. दूसरी चीज ये है कि it all depends on the kind of questions that people ask. Adam Smith asked a question, you know, Rousseau asked a question, Plato asked a question. Questions are very important. अब हमारी प्रोफेशन में जो चीज आ गई, एज यू मेंशनड अभी रिसेंटली, कि जी एक तो वो थियरी है, दूसरा ये है कि आई थिंक वी आर आल्सो नाउ बीइंग ड्रिवन बाय डेटा. Everybody is looking for data, and then data पे वो कहते हैं अच्छा मैं रिग्रेशन रन कर लूँ and I'm done, it's okay. बट वो आ जाती है जो मेरे दिमाग में एक चीज, वो पुराना जोक नहीं है कि बंदा चाबियां ढूंढ रहा है अंडर अ लैम्प, और उससे जब पुलिस वाला आके थोड़ी देर चाबी ढूंढता है, फिर कहता है भाई ये चाबी तुम्हारी गुमी कहाँ थी? उसने कहा मेरी गाड़ी के पास. तो कहता गाड़ी कहाँ? कहता वो गाड़ी 1 मील दूर खड़ी. कहता वहां क्यों नहीं ढूंढते? कहता वहां बत्ती नहीं है. तो आर वी काइंड ऑफ बीइंग लेड बाय द लैम्प लाइट के हम डेटा के पीछे भाग रहे हैं, हम थियरी के पीछे भाग रहे हैं, बट जो रेलेवेंट क्वेश्चंस हैं, आर वी मिसिंग देम? सो इफ यू पुट दैट sort of model in your mind, पाकिस्तान के क्वेश्चंस जो हैं वो हैं क्या, और are we missing them, or are we actually researching them?
I think you make a fair point, G. I think it's almost a case of putting the cart before the horse in the sense of looking at what the data is and then trying to, and it's also we've sort of automated a lot, right? So we have what we call these, you said linear regression, but and some people use this term of machine learning, but for me, regression is also kind of
Yeah.
supervised machine learning algorithm, right? So there is this tendency to, yeah, let's just throw the data into the machine, which is a bit of a black box, and see what it spits out. And because of that, there is, I think, वो tendency आ गई है. And because of that, the role of theory has become less important. And I think now more than ever, there has to be, we're all guilty of this. I'm guilty of this myself as well. We've got other in, हमारे भी incentives ऐसे, we have to publish as well, all of these other stuff. So वो भी एक issue है वहाँ पे. And I think you're right. The issue is there's not enough of thinking about what the real fundamental questions are for our particular context, because there's also this tendency to try and import a way of thinking and asking questions which might be relevant for some other region but might not be relevant for us. So वो है, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front. I think ये भी issue होता है कि by the time we get students, there's a lot of unlearning that needs to take place before the learning begins, and we're all guilty of that. So I think that certainly is a problem that we need to try collectively as a quote unquote educationists we have to try and resolve. My sense is I think the only way perhaps the most efficient method is actually to just get the kids at a much lower age, right? Where get them at a much lower age where you try and I benefited a lot from just studying philosophy because it helped my brain to think about what the relevant questions are versus the irrelevant questions, right? To think critically about these sorts of things. Um, And that's the thing that I think is missing for a lot of our students, right? Because, and it's not necessarily their fault. It's just, it's the system that they go through, right? A lot of the students that we get at LUMS, they go through this O and A level system where, you know, you just have, it's almost like uh, a puzzle solving exercise now. You just have to learn how to give the paper, right? How to attempt a paper. And so it defeats that point of actually thinking critically. So I agree with you. I think these are all important things that we should think about. Not a lot of emphasis is done on this. Um, and also now it's a scary time because with how quickly AI is developing, um, you know, वो भी थोड़ा सा issue आ रहा है, I know some colleagues of mine at LUMS who sort of worry about some jobs becoming redundant and being replaced by these AI bots, right? Um, I'm not as skeptical as those colleagues because I feel like like when I was growing up in the 1990s going into the 2000s, the big thing that came was the internet. And so the main sort of jump that I had as a child that my parents did not, people of your generation did not, was, we had this Google search, so you could search for anything, right? And so I think that's a similar kind of jump has happened with this sort of young generation, is that it's almost the jump that we had with Google search, they have now with Claude or ChatGPT or these kinds of things. And so I think there's a bit of a novelty factor, but I think my sort of more optimistic or sort of trying to see this silver lining is to say, well, what could be the good thing that might come out of this is that we might be able to delegate more and more of the mathematical stuff to these AI machines, right? So they can do a lot of the AI is very good at doing calculus, at teaching us calculus, at doing this sort of advanced mathematical, heavy lifting. Um, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because if you use it properly, that will allow you to spend more of your gray matter thinking about these important sort of the real fundamental questions that we should be perhaps focusing more on, right? So in all of this, I think if we approach it in the right way, there might be something that beneficial that comes out of it.
Osama, thank you very much. I think there's a lot to talk, but as I keep telling people, okay, this is not the last time I hope we talk. I think we should, very interesting conversation. We should do more of these because quite frankly, मैं ये करता हूँ इसलिए कि ये हमारे जो students हैं, they get a window into बहुत सारे lumps तो नहीं आ सकते, but now they've got a window into your brain from this. So I'm hoping that we can do more of these. Please tell your
Absolutely.
colleagues to come and do this because we need to talk about it. And I'll trouble you from time to time again for a conversation because I think it's very important to do this. So I thank you. If any last word you have to say, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nadeem Saab. It's no trouble at all. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Let me take this opportunity to commend you on actually, taking this step. I remember एक दफा पहले भी हमारी बात हुई थी over the phone, um, and you said, you just want to provide an avenue or sort of platform where economists can sit down and talk with each other and discuss and share ideas. So I think it's a very valuable thing you're doing. I commend you for it. And yeah, I very much look forward to having another conversation with you again, inshallah, soon.
Thank you very much, Osama. Look
Thank
forward
you,
to
Deep.
seeing you
Thank
soon.
you.
Bye bye. Khuda Hafiz.